Thank you, everyone. So this is a little provocative. I brought my husband with me. I drag him around a lot with me. We're newlyweds, and you get that period of time where you get to tell them what to do, and they just agree with you. So he's in the back of the room. He's a pastor of a big church in Denver, and he said a minute ago, "This is like church. Everybody's sitting at the back." So don't move your seats. I'm not going to tell you to move forward, but I'm going to come into the audience if I can. I just want to take just a couple of seconds to thank you all for what you're doing every day in the lives of young people and in the lives of our community members. You don't have to be doing what you're doing, and not everyone can do what you're doing, and I just want to thank you for that. So the time that I have with you today, I think if I can give you a framework for it, will be just some of my musings about what I think it's going to take for us to become a more inclusive society, more inclusive in our workplaces, more inclusive in our schools, and they are just things for you to be thinking about as you contemplate now how we engage more people in the work that we're doing and that we are able to serve in a way that I think we'll need to for our future. This is an opportunity for you to ask any questions and to weigh in with any opinions that you have too. I'm not that flat about what I'm talking about where you wouldn't have an opportunity to weigh in. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to throw some things your way. Here are a couple of the objectives that I hope that we'll meet today. There are three that I've got listed here, and based on what you hear and what you feel, you may accomplish more out of this. But frankly, what I'd like to do is to talk about how inclusion is important, particularly in this socio-political season that we're in. I want you to understand some tools for how to have good developmental dialogue in the season that we're in, and awesomely, we will learn how inclusion actually creates better environments that engages our students, our colleagues, and our community. So we'll hit all of those in under an hour. I want to just start right on with the premise of inclusion. So how many of you can remember, if you weren't high at the time, how many of you can remember when you first heard about diversity for the first time? When it was kind of like a campaign. Do you kind of remember when you first heard about it? What decade? Now this is the part when you weren't high. What decade was it when you first started to hear about diversity in a campaign-y kind of way? It was marketed well. Do you remember? This is the part where you talk. Do you remember what decade it was? 80s. Who said 80s? 80s. Okay, so whoever said the 80s, you're absolutely right. It was the 1980s when we started to hear about diversity in a kind of campaign-y way. What was going on in the 80s that would have made this be the topic of the day? What was happening in the 80s, if you can remember it, or if you were born? What was going on in the 80s? This is when you know everybody was high. The AIDS epidemic. This is what I'm hearing. The AIDS epidemic. Absolutely right. AIDS epidemic happened. We were talking about gay Americans. We had no idea what to do with that. What else was happening in the 80s? Okay, you might not know about this, but the crack epidemic was happening. War on drugs started in the 1980s. Something else was happening in the 80s. Women, we've always been happening, but in the 80s, we were really happening because we were coming into the workplace in higher numbers, in particular in leadership positions, women. People of color were coming into the workplace at higher levels and in particular in leadership roles. There's all kinds of diversity happening in the 1980s that we'd not really talked about out loud. And I have to tell you that the culmination of all of those diversities and all of that going on at one time got us in a position to talk about diversity in an interesting kind of a way. And when I say that it was campaigny. I know, because I was there. We did things like we created bumper stickers that said, value diversity, embrace diversity, tolerance. It had those kind of words. It really was a kumbaya sort of scenario to get people on board with diversity, frankly, because we didn't know what to do with it. And so out of that period came what I will call the two greatest travesties that ever happened on the issue of diversity in the 1980s. I totally made these up, but I'm telling you these were the travesties. Here's the first travesty. The first travesty I call the travesty of what we did to white people in diversity training in 1980s. What we did in the 1980s with white people with diversity training is we said, white people, you have to go to this mandatory diversity class. And then we go into the class and we start teaching you all about diversity. And we describe diversity as everything except white. It was the definition of everything that wasn't white. And that is how we trained it. We did not have an opportunity for people that identified as white to talk about their own stories, their ancestry, their lineage, as if those things didn't exist in their lives. That's what we did in the 1980s. That's the travesty of what we did to white people in the 1980s diversity training. There was a second travesty that happened at the same time. It was the travesty of what we did to people of color in diversity training in the 1980s. And with people of color, they had to go to diversity training too. But what we talked about was the oppressions of people of color. Those things are true, because there were oppressions of people of color. But the travesty is that's all we talked about. We didn't talk about the contributions, the benefits, the attributes, the inventions that came from people of color. We talked in a very limited way about the ancestry, the stories, and the lineage of people of color, but not in a very robust way. That was a travesty. So those two travesties are in many ways what brings us here today. Is the setup of this conversation was poor from the very beginning. We did not honor white people and their stories, and we didn't fully honor people of color and their stories. And here we are today in 2016, almost 2017, and we need to have a conversation about inclusion with an audience who wasn't set up to have that conversation in the first place. And so I feel strongly, very strongly, that our opportunity is now to talk about where we probably went wrong in the initial conversation, honor everybody in the room for their diversity, and then talk about what inclusion looks like from there. But I wanted to level set my thoughts around where I think we went wrong in the dialogue. I also want you to know something about diversity, whichever way we got here in the training and the conversation about diversity. The thing that this room knows, and I want to honor in you, is that each of us has a story, a diversity story. And your diversity story will shape up how you feel about everything that's going on today. I always tell the story that I grew up in the segregated South. I remember separate water fountains, and I remember Negroes Not Allowed signs, and that was the era that I lived in. I went to the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, where we had a winning football team, but we also had lots of cross burnings that happened while I was there. And so my framework around diversity has a lot to do with what my eyes have seen in my lifetime, and so does yours. And so as we talk about some of the things that it will take for us to be inclusive, what I don't want you to lose sight of is we're all very different in our experiences and how we think about diversity, and that is perfectly fine. So let's jump into a phenomenon. This phenomenon is called diversity fatigue. Who in the room has ever heard of diversity fatigue? Anybody heard of that before? Okay, so you're good because you're not fatigued. Not because of diversity, maybe, but you might be fatigued. So even if you've never heard of it, don't you worry about it. Here's what diversity fatigue is. It means I'm sick and tired of talking about diversity. That's what diversity fatigue means in the not eloquent way. And I'm sharing that term with you because whether we want to admit it or not, we all have had it or are having it right this second. We have diversity fatigue. And each one of us has diversity fatigue for a different reason. Sometimes it's the experiences that we've had. Sometimes it's because we're lost. It can be a host of experience that gets us to having diversity fatigue. But I'm sharing it with you in the spirit of inclusion because we all have it. Now, this diversity fatigue is different than discrimination. It doesn't mean you're a racist or a sexist or a homophobe and fill in the blank if you've got diversity fatigue. It means that there's something that has worn you down about this topic of diversity. It's not hate-based. Yes, sir. Yeah, so this is good. He says, do you think political correctness has something to do with that? I absolutely do. I think political correctness makes us exhausted because it keeps us sometimes from just having a straight, direct conversation. So I think you're right as a contributor to diversity fatigue. When I told you my story about living in the segregated South and the things that I saw, that's one of the reasons I've got diversity fatigue, because I've got diversity fatigue. I've got it because I've been talking about diversity since I was born in systems that were really sort of oppressive, and I'm exhausted from it. And so I want to operationally show you what happens to you when you have diversity fatigue. So when you have diversity fatigue, it doesn't just stay in your head. You really have a visceral reaction to stuff when you have diversity fatigue. So my diversity fatigue comes from having talked about this since the 1960s, and so I know what triggers my diversity fatigue. The trigger for my diversity fatigue is when somebody starts complaining about how they've been discriminated against, and I see it as way smaller than drinking out of a separate water fountain. So I use my own experiences, and I listen to their experience, and I don't see them as the same, and it triggers my diversity fatigue. That's not fair, but that's what it does. So something happens to my body when my diversity fatigue is triggered. It looks like this. And so when that happens, it means I can't hear you anymore, and what you're saying is probably really ridiculous. And so that's not your story. It might be. But your story plays out the same way depending on what that thing is that triggered you and what your body looks like when it happens. When your body looks like something, other people are looking at you and making judgments about what that means. And so I'm sharing this in the spirit of inclusion with you because each of us in this room has to keep our diversity fatigue in check. It doesn't mean make it go away. It means understand why you have it, what triggers it, and what do you look like when it's at play. It's really important that we do that. And for us to be able to have inclusive dialogue, we've got to get that one under control. So I wanted to share that as a concept for you, just so you understand it. Here's a couple of other things I want you to understand. This is really important right now in our social climate. There are some things that are barriers to us being inclusive. And one of those things is fear. We all have fear. We're all afraid of something. But these are two fear bases that I really want you to understand. The first one is something that's called the state of fear. This is, I am afraid because I've been through this before, or I've seen this before, or this has happened to me before. So it is legitimately a fear that has something to do with something that's happened to you before. That's the state of fear. The second one is something called the trait of fear. This one's a little bit different because it really is about imagined danger. Nothing ever happened to you before. You've never even seen it before. You may have heard about this thing before, but it has never happened to you. It's an imagined danger that you have. Why is this important in inclusion? Well, for one, you've got to figure out if you're living in one of these two places. And which place do you live in most? Are the words that are coming out of your mouth based on something that's an imagined fear, a trait of fear, or is it real life stuff that you're talking about that really happened? And the people that you are talking to, the students that you're serving, the communities that you're serving, where are they living now? We just got out of a really wonderful meeting with the police chief here in Grand Junction, and I talked about the state and the trait of fear, where there are communities across the country. Some are living absolutely in a state of fear around policing, and others are living in a trait of fear around things that have happened with policing. And we've got to reconcile in our communities what people are living in and places that they're speaking from. So I want you to know, as you think about inclusion, it will be very important for all of us to be thinking about, when we speak in particular, what fear trait are we doing that from? This is a really busy slide, and its only purpose is just to talk to you a little bit about trends in diversity and inclusion. You know, back in the old days, which was like a week ago, we talked about diversity in silos. We talked about race by itself. We talked about gender by itself. And so what's important for all of us to be thinking about with inclusion is you can't talk about diversity in those silos anymore. We have to begin to talk about intersectionality. When you look at me, I don't know if you noticed that I was black. I am. But, and maybe you noticed that I'm a female. I am. But there are these other diversities about me that you may not even see, that are just as important to me as my gender and my race. If we continue to look at diversity in those silos, we miss the richness of people's diversities, number one. We go back to 1980, where we assumed some people didn't even have a diversity because we ill-defined them, and you don't get an opportunity to have the right conversations because we don't know about those intersections. So this slide just shows you that there's everything from people with disabilities and veteran status. Happy Veterans Day for the vets in the room, by the way. From religious diversity to race, and that those intersections, all of those diversities could just be talking about one person, and we have to know that in the folks that we serve. Here's another thing that I know you know all about, and that is social factors really do matter when we are creating inclusive cultures. So you know this better than most, that depending on the social determinants that people have in their lives will dictate whether they have a great life or a bad life. For example, if you don't live in a safe neighborhood, there's a track that you may go down that might not be good. Or if you don't have access to good health care or good education, the likelihood that you have a great job might be decreased. We know that there are people that are living with stigmas attached to them, and then that takes them down a different path. So depending on what social factors are at play will drive where a person's life goes. This is important for us to understand, especially with our kids. The one that I always highlight when I talk about these social factors is the one that says social exclusion. And you know what social exclusion is. It can happen in communities. It can even happen in a school. It's usually people that somehow are just not included in anything that we're doing. Sometimes it's because they're invisible to us. Sometimes it's, frankly, we just don't even want them there. And so the story that I'm going to share with you is, how do we deal with social exclusion and create inclusion at the same time? So here's my story. So a few years ago, I left my very comfortable suburban life in Denver and decided, when my daughter was grown and moved out of the house, that I was going to move into the hood. I wanted a loft, I wanted to be cool, and I wanted to get closer to where the work was that I cared about. I didn't really like driving from the suburbs every day to go into the city and do the work that I thought needed to be done. So I decided I was going to live there. My daughter thought I was nuts. My mother thought I'd created a drug habit and lost my job. And she couldn't figure out how I was moving from this comfortable life to this place that I had no experience in. So anyway, I get into the inner city of Denver, and I'm learning new things every day, like Those aren't fireworks that you hear, Nita. Those are gunshots. Those kinds of things were happening in my life. There's a couple of other things that happened. Those of you that sort of live in an area that's suburban and probably in Grand Junction, this is, maybe you don't see this, but in the city, there's a lot of litter. And litter is just not something that I'd ever contemplated. I wasn't in an area where there was a lot of litter. So the first thing I saw was a lot of just crap all over the place. I'd walk my dog every day and I'd pick up trash, and it was bizarre. The other thing that I noticed a lot is drug dealers, gang members. And I don't know about your suburbs, but we didn't have those in the suburbs either. So I had these two new parts of the world that I was experiencing. So one of the things that I noticed about the gang members that were dealing drugs in my community is everybody knew they were there, but everybody just tap danced around them. We didn't want them there. They were socially excluded. I mean, who wants the drug dealing gang member on their block? But they were there, and they were a part of our community. So I decided if I really wanted to show what inclusion was, at least in my own life, I needed to tackle the thing that was right in front of me. So on this particular day, while the drug dealer gang members were standing on the corner, we'll just call them the 5 Crips for now, I decided I was going to do an intervention. So the 5 Crips were standing about where you're sitting. And I said, come here. And so the guys are looking around, and I said, no, you, come here. And so I don't know if they thought I needed to buy drugs. I'm not really sure what was going on, but I had them come across the street where I was. So they got to me, and I said, hey, every day I'm walking this dog, and I'm picking up trash. That's all I do is pick up trash. I need your leadership. This is our community. We've got to do better than this. Yeah, they looked exactly like you're looking right now. So they thought I was strange, and so one of the guys said, we didn't put the trash down there. And I said, well, I know you didn't put the trash down there, but this is our community, so we got to do something about this. And I proceeded to put my hand behind my back. Don't do that. I'm telling you, that's not what you do. But I did. I put my hand behind my back to pull out trash bags. And I gave a trash bag to each of the 5 Crips. And then I proceeded to walk down my street and pick up trash and pray. So when we got to the end of the block, I looked, they were picking up trash behind me. I turned to them, I took their trash bags, and I said, thank you for your leadership. This is what community is all about. Now stay out of trouble. Then I had a heart attack, and then they left. So that was like a 5-minute deal. It took me longer to tell you the story, but that was like a 5-minute deal that I did. But here's what happened after that day. I did not end gang activity in the city and county of Denver. I'm not that arrogant. But here's what happened. There were not 5 Crips dealing drugs on my block anymore after that day. And I've been there over a decade, and they're not back on that block dealing drugs. And something really interesting has happened about litter on my block. We don't have that kind of litter happening on my block for over a decade since. So I'm telling you this story because that's what inclusion looks like. It can be a simple thing like taking people that could be socially excluded and saying, you're a part of community, and I need you to do something in this community, and what you're doing right now is not it. And so if you'll notice about that story, what I did not say was, quit dealing drugs on my corner. I didn't talk about drugs. I didn't talk about gang activity. I didn't talk about any of it. I said, I need your leadership to help me take care of this community. And I showed them what it looks like. That's what inclusion is really all about. Here's another thing. How many of you remember Maslow's hierarchy? You remember that? Some of you remember that. 1954 model. This guy said, Maslow says, hey, if you don't meet people's basic needs, I don't care who they are, they can't hear a word you're saying, and they're not going to do anything that you're saying because you haven't met their basic needs. So this model I always use when I describe what it is to be inclusive. So let me just run through it really quickly, and I'll tell you how it works. In Maslow's hierarchy, we all start at the bottom. We don't all think we start at the bottom, but we all start at the bottom at this place that's called physiological. Physiological needs are your most basic needs: food, water, shelter, sex, and air. I didn't make those up. That's what he said. You can order those any way you like, but he said food, water, shelter, sex, and air have to happen or people can't function. Once those basic needs are met, you jump up to the next level called safety. This is your security level. This is, I feel like my job is secure, my roof's not going to cave in, my car is going to start, I feel safe in my community. Whatever security means to you happens there. And then you move up to the next level, social, and that is your belongingness level. I belong to a church, a school, a workplace, a team, a family, whatever that is, that's your belongingness. And then that fourth one is esteem. That's your confidence level. I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm saying, feel good about that. And then you get to the top, self-actualization. I've arrived, da-da, I've learned it all, I've done it all, I've seen it all. So the way this thing works is we go up and down this hierarchy 1,000,000 times in our lives, 1,000,000 times. It just depends on what's happening. If you've ever gotten a divorce, you're going up this thing and you're coming back down. If you've ever lost someone that you love, if you've ever lost a job, you're going up this hierarchy and you're coming back down. It's just how we roll. That's how it works. The thing that you can't do is skip steps. I know that there are people that think they jumped from physiological all the way to the top. It doesn't work that way. It always goes in sequential order. But why is this important when we talk about inclusion and in creating inclusion? It's important because oftentimes when we're experts, which everybody in this room is expert in what you're doing, or you probably wouldn't even be here, we talk from the top of this hierarchy, but the people that we're talking to are not listening to us from that place. And so much of what we say sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher. It's want, 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 because they're listening from a different place in the hierarchy. So if I can give you an example, if a person is at physiological, the bottom of this hierarchy, and I don't mean bottom in a bad way, but it's just at the bottom of the hierarchy. If a person's at physiological, when you are speaking, no matter what you're talking about, they're listening to see how what you're talking about has something to do with their livelihood. How does what you're saying have to do with my mortgage, my rent, my car payment, my kids' college tuition, my whatever their livelihood is? They're trying to translate what you're saying to see how it impacts that. That's what physiological listeners are doing. If the person's at safety, they're already afraid of what you're going to say before you actually start to say it. And the whole time you're saying what you're saying, they may be a little bit cynical, because they may not trust that what you're saying is all of the story or all of the truth, and that somehow they're going to be negatively impacted by what you're saying. You start talking about the budget or finances with people at safety, they think they're going to get laid off. And so that's how they're translating what you're saying. People at social, they're pretty engaged. They understand what you're talking about and are probably the ones that have the most questions to ask about your topic. People that are at esteem, they're very engaged. They probably had already studied whatever it is you're talking about already, so they're in the know. And then the people at self-actualization, you could sense a little bit of arrogance there. They're probably the ones that are going to shoot holes in whatever you're saying because they think they know more than you do anyway. So that's what Maslow means in the world. Why is this important in inclusion? You have to start to think about where you're speaking from most often. Are you always speaking from self-actualization? Are you always speaking from esteem? And where are people listening to you from? And are those messages translating in the way that you want? Now, here is what this isn't. This is not a socioeconomic model. It's not a poverty model. So when you look at physiological, don't think, well, those are the people that are poor. I can tell you right now, I work for Children's Hospital. I have a great salary. I've been blessed. I always think about everything from a physiological level. I always want to know how what you're talking about has to do with my livelihood and that of my family. And I oftentimes don't gravitate from that level. And so I listen for that. So you should know that too about inclusion. Based on what you're saying, people could be listening and interpreting from any of those different places. So that's an opportunity for us to get inclusive by just having some knowledge about how people are hearing us. Do you remember this movie? You remember Rush Hour? This is how you can tell how old people are in the room. Some people are like, who's Chris Tucker and what is Rush Hour? My students here on the front row. So one of the lines from Rush Hour is, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? You remember that's his famous line? And so this kind of goes back to, sir, your question about political correctness. There's another thing for us to be thinking about with becoming inclusive and the things that we have to do to encourage inclusion, and that is words. What have words done over time to either help that along or to hurt that? This is a great place for me to give you yet another one of Nita Tyler's opinions. How many of you have heard the term cultural competency? You've heard that. You need to be culturally competent. Okay, so here's my opinion. I don't think it's possible to be culturally competent, and I can't stand that phraseology. I can't stand that phraseology because I've been black my entire life, and I can't tell you that I'm completely competent about being black. And I would imagine for every diversity that there is, if somebody expects you to have complete mastery of that diversity, you're doomed from the very beginning. There's no such thing as having complete competency about anything cultural. What we really should be after is that we become culturally responsive. The reality is we're never going to know everything about culture, and culture will continue to evolve, particularly around words. What we can be accountable for is how responsive we are about all things cultural. How do we learn? And when we do learn, how do we then respond in a way that's more appropriate? So it gives us all an opportunity to continue to grow. One of those travesties that happened in 1980 is when we said people should be culturally competent, and then people went out and tried to have mastery, absolute, finite mastery of all things cultural, and you really can't, nor should you want to. Here's words. This is just a sampling of words. In the last session, I told the group a wonderful exercise to do with students is to have them answer number one for you. Are there words or phrases that just drive you nuts, that really get in the way of inclusion? Things that are so offensive or just make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, that really get in the way of people being able to hear you. This is Maslow's hierarchy. They can't hear you because the words have got in the way. And allow people to express what those are. Again, this is what cultural responsiveness calls for. It calls for you simply asking people to tell you what those words or phrases really are. You don't have to decide for them. I can tell you right now, I hate it when somebody says, you people. And some people say that just real innocently. Okay, you people, I can't stand it. It drives me nuts. And then I can't hear another word you're saying after you do that. There are other things that would drive people crazy. I just have a few up here to think about. African American or black. How many of you use black as your vernacular? Okay, like 3 people in the whole room. The rest of you better be saying African American. Not sure. I'm not going to ask. But this one is a complicated one. And it has everything to do, in some cases, about what generation you're from and where you live. So there are some parts of the country where black is perfectly fine. There are other parts of the country where it's like, I don't know if I'm supposed to say that. And then there's my mother who can't stand black. Because in her generation, black was short for blackie. And it was derogatory in her generation in the segregated South. So she can't stand it. I dig it. It's just perfectly fine with me. So this is what, to your point, people don't know what to say anymore. We're a little bit nervous, like, am I supposed to say black to her, or is African American safer? This is the season that we're in where we don't know what to say. There actually is no right or wrong. It's episodic and it's individual about what you use and what you don't use. Terminology like illegal immigrants. That iteration, I mean, I remember the days when it was aliens, and then we went to illegal aliens, and then, so there's illegal immigrants, and now it's undocumented, people without papers. And so we've got these iterations. This is why cultural competency is not the goal. We've got these iterations of words and phraseology that we've got to get on board with. Queer, you remember when, you better not be calling somebody queer. And now when you look at the acronym LGBTQ, queer is acceptable, has new meaning, isn't the derogatory term that it was just a decade ago, and we've got to get on board with the evolution of the words. So good practice for us as leaders is to begin talking to, in particular, our young people about the evolution of words. They're very helpful in telling us what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate. We don't have to figure all of this stuff out. Now, I know some words you probably shouldn't be saying, but these are some of the words, just a sampling of the ones that we should be talking about and how they've evolved and what we should be saying. So this is a part of what inclusion is too, is talking about our words. I want to sort of wrap up by sharing something that's also very important, and that is power. In this country, we talk about power a lot, but we typically talk about it in a negative way. And this construct, another one from the 1950s, really talks about power in a way that I think is inclusive. It talks about power in terms of us all having power, which is really what we would want to have happen. The model says that we all have power, but we just get it from different places. So I'm going to run through it real quickly and tell you how it works. First power base is the one we know most. It's legitimate power. It's power that's based on our title, our rank, or our position. But I want you to listen to me carefully. I did not say that you had to be competent. We all know people that have legitimate power and maybe not a brain in their head, I'm not sure. But that happens. Expert power is the competency one. That one is you get your power from your skills, your abilities, your knowledge. But listen carefully, that one has nothing to do with the title. My story is Graciela. Graciela worked at the City and County of Denver when I was the head of HR there. Graciela was in the custodial staff. She had a broom and a mop, spoke very little English, but came to my office every single day, at the end of the day, the entire time I worked at the city, to give me a leadership tip. And she wanted me to use that leadership tip the next day. She did that the entire time I was there. And I said, you've got expert power. No one had ever told her in her life that she had any kind of power, and particularly not expert power. And so I want you to think about that for a minute. That is power, and we're untapped in our ability to tell people that they've got that kind of power. Graciela had it, and I told her so. Referent power is the third one. Referent power is reciprocity. It's the power of mutual respect. I respect you, you respect me back, therefore I have power. Reward power, how many of you are parents? Yeah, you know about this one. This is, you've got the power to give and take away rewards. Car keys, allowance, you name it. We do it at work too, the days off, whatever the reward is. These are the folks that have the power to give them and take them away. And then that last one is coercive power, the power to punish other people. Simple. We use all of these, every one of them. Just depends on what's going on. But here's how it works. We usually use power bases paired up. It's two at a time that we're using them. They're pairs. It comes in pairs. So if you look at this power base list, forget the sort of industry. What power-based combination of two do you think we see most often in this country, regardless of system or industry? What do you think? This is the part where you talk. I'm hearing legitimate. What's the second one? Coercive, that's right. Absolutely. Number one, legitimate coercive power. Number one country, power base in this country, regardless of system. 85% of the time, we see legitimate coercive power. Now, of all of the things that I've said about inclusion, what power-based combination of two do you think we'd have to have for us to be inclusive or to have inclusive systems? Don't say legitimate coercive power. What power-based combination do you think? Referent and what? Expert, that's right. Referent expert power would be the number one power base to have in place to create a system of inclusion, and it says another thing in the definition too. Also, you would have authentic leadership. It says you would need to have that expert referent power to have both of those, inclusion and authentic leadership. So that's what we've got to get to. That's our challenge, is how do we go from systems that might be legitimate coercive to systems that really are about expert referent power. So we're not doomed. We've done this before probably a million times in history, but 2 times I can tell you about were the civil rights movement and the women's movement. In both cases, there's still lots of work to do, but in both cases, it was a legitimate coercive power base that really was overdone and overrun by the prominence of expert referent power. So those are all possible and things that we'll have to do. I promised that I was going to talk about developmental dialogue. So how do we kind of create this? Based on all the things I've said, how do we create conversations that are inclusive? I should have not bulleted these and just made them 1, 2, and 3, but number one is we've got to get to a point now where we're talking about our commonalities. We've spent decades now talking about how different we are, and that's beautiful. But at what point do we talk about the common threads that bind us? And so that's an opportunity for trust building when we get to the point where we can talk about what's the sameness about us. The second bullet, or number 2, is these undisputable differences. In our dialogue, one of the things that happens because we're inflamed and emotional, and rightfully so on all kinds of levels, is we come to the table with our emotions, and sometimes we don't come to the table with facts. And so in this part of the dialogue, we should start to leverage data and leverage statistics in what we're talking about. And here is where you're building your credibility with facts and data. And then lastly, this is the piece that we do the best, is this is making space for emotions and values and beliefs, a safe space to have those conversations. So if you think about the sort of math here, we spend a lot of time with number 3, or the third bullet, creating spaces for dialogue, and we spend less time talking about what ties us together and the facts associated with what we're talking about. So we stay in the emotional place and we don't come out of it. And so for action to occur, for inclusion to really occur, where we really are making people count versus just counting people, those 3 things need to be in place, and that really is our work. This slide, it's me, an ass, and another lady. Sometimes I say, which one is the ass? But we don't have time for that. So this rule is very important for you to think about, too. Some of you have probably heard of the 20-60-20 rule. I kind of live my life with this one. 20% of the people, whatever people you're talking about, are going to love you no matter what. They're going to accept you. They're going to love you. You can fail. You can screw up. They're going to love you, and they're going to be with you. 60% of the people are always going to be tentative. They're not against you, but they're not really sure. These are the independents, undecideds. And then 20% of the people are never going to be with you. They're just not. And if you were passing out gold bars, they still wouldn't be with you. And so if you think about that in the context of students that we work with, community members, I mean, you name it, where do you think we spend most of our time? We spend most of our time with the bottom 20. The 20% that are never going to engage with us in the first place. And so I'm inviting all of us to be thinking about this 80% of the people that we work with that need us. 20% of them are already engaged with us, and the other 60% need to be mobilized with what we're talking about. And if you think about that 60% in the middle and you think about everything else I've talked about today, we have such an opportunity to hear differently, to speak differently, and to understand differently, to have almost 80% of everybody that we work with feel included and engaged in our work. Remember this about inclusion? It really has 3 parts. Whenever you are being inclusive, literally what you're doing is you're leveraging the diversity of other people. That's really what inclusion is. It's not the same thing as diversity. It is leveraging the diversity of the people around you. But in order to do that, 3 things have to happen. Whatever you're leveraging, if you have a Spanish-speaking person in your team and you want to leverage their bilingual skills, that's one of their diversities. You should make sure that whatever you're leveraging in their bilingual skills, that it's a win-win for them as an individual to leverage those skills. Oftentimes, when we have a bilingual person, we're just like, yay, the community will be happy, and we're going to be happy. We never stop to think about whether that's a win-win for them. So win-win for the individual, win-win for your organization, and win-win for the community. If you can pass those 3 filters in what you're leveraging, chances are you've done a great job with being inclusive. Here's where we are in the world. We are in a new world with new things to figure out, and things are not as black and white as they used to be. They never were really black and white, but they're less black and white, less clarity now about what we're supposed to do. And so this visual just illustrates the complexities of what we have to do as practitioners of inclusion. Know that most of us are operating in that little small circle called our comfort zone. And all the magic is happening, especially with our young people, in the bigger circle. And we've got to figure out a way to get to where the magic is happening. We'll do that through inclusion. There's my stuff. My stuff is at your disposal. If there's anything that I can do to answer a question, help you along, or give you a further musing about inclusion, I'm happy to do that. Here's what I want you to know. There are several things that I want you to remember. I hope that some of these tools will be helpful to you. But one thing I do want you to remember is that you have to go back in history and think about whether or not we were prepared for today's conversation. And all of us. And be kind to yourself about what we do next. This has been a choppy ride to get to this point where we can talk about inclusion. We have a tremendous opportunity, burden to fulfill, and that is a country that is at unrest right now. And that socio-political unrest doesn't just stay on the streets. It comes to school, it comes to work, it comes to church, it comes to this room, it comes wherever we go. And so our responsibility, particularly with our young people now, is to create systems of healing and systems of understanding and systems of truth-telling about how we got here and what we're going to need to do to have a community that I think honors diversity in all of us. So I thank you for being committed to doing what I think will be very difficult work, but very meaningful work in all of our lives. This is not the time for finger pointing. There's enough of that going on outside of here. This is a time for healing. And I think that those of you that are committed enough to be in an education system just like you are going to be the key to that happening. So I thank you so much for that commitment. So before I depart, because I've gotten my warning back there, I will give an opportunity to you. If you've got any questions or comments or thoughts, I'm happy to answer any of that before you depart. If anybody has anything they need from me, yes. It's okay for white people to say black. Just don't say it to my mom, though. Yeah. No. It's okay for white people to say black. It's totally okay. Just know that there may be people that generationally have a negative thought about the word black, like my mom. But it is a safe word. And over our history, the evolution of Black America, it's gone from being a very empowering word to one that I think has gotten diluted a bit with African American. But it's perfectly fine for you to say black. Don't be scared. Just tell them Nita said it was okay. And then everything will be fine. Kidding, don't tell them that. Thank you for asking that question. Anything else? Do you have to go back to work now? I could keep talking. Yes, sir. I would take you back to the developmental dialogue. I would take you back to those 3 bullets. The one that said, have a safe space for conversation, have a way to talk about what's common about us, and have something that's factual about us. I would leave you with that because I promise you that is our failure point. It's our failure point in policing. It's our failure point in education. It's our failure point in education, in healthcare, that we just stay with creating the safe space for conversation, and we sometimes don't come to the table with facts. And facts, you know, we were talking to police a minute ago, facts are not police. We want you to come with the facts. Both sides of the table, this is referent power, both sides of the table have to come with facts about why they're feeling what they're feeling. And then that commonality piece, we've totally skipped that. We've been set up that way, but we've totally skipped that commonality piece. So I would say the developmental dialogue methodology would be the takeaway I would want most people to start thinking about. Where do we get stuck? I know that we get stuck in Denver with the safe spaces, and we don't go past that. Thank you for asking that. Anything else? Okay, well, I don't want to get you in trouble because you're supposed to be back at work, but maybe you just walk real slow. Thank you very much.